only a few Zen teachers living in North America. He had no idea that in his lifetime so many Americans would take up the practice of Zen. On the assumption that teachers 2. would remain scarce here, he included Yasutani Roshi's private encounters with 10 Westerners in the 3 pillars of Zen for the sake of readers who would have no personal guide of their own. He could not have foreseen the explosion of interest in Zen Buddhism since then, or that his own book would be a major detonator of that explosion. Fast forward to 1999. For their annual meeting, the American Zen Teachers Association sent out invitations to 107 North American men and women who were functioning independently as sanctioned Zen teachers. The size of this population reflects the most measurable element of a tide of interest in Zen that has been rising ever since the original publication of the 3 pillars. Houston Smith, in his preface to the first edition, posed the question of whether Zen would successfully make the stride across the Pacific to America in its migration eastward from Asia and India, wisely answering, "We don't know." Now, however, we do. With hundreds of groups of Zen practitioners scattered across the Americas and Europe, and teachers proliferating at a geometric rate, Zen has clearly taken in the West. This Western Zen has already assumed many different forms, for like Buddhism generally, it will inevitably make an accommodation to those who practice it. This process has been repeated each time Zen crossed over to a new country. Zen originated in China as Chen, a hybrid of Indian Buddhism and the native beliefs of Taoism and Confucianism. Chen then became Sun in Korea and Zen in Japan, further adapting itself to those cultures. Now immigrant teachers of Chen, Sun, and Japanese and Vietnamese Zen have all established their respective strains of Dharma practice in the West. All these different traditions have retained some of their indigenous elements, but naturally they have also been altered by Occidental culture. What happens when an ancient, non-theistic, contemplative religion rooted in agrarian Asian culture is transplanted to highly mobile, urban Western countries dominated by consumer culture? Many of us are watching, as wide-eyed as Bodhidharma, to find out. We are involved in a colossal shift, unprecedented in either Buddhism or the West, and while the cultural forces in motion are largely beyond our control, we need to be as watchful as possible. This meeting of civilizations is just beginning, but already we can identify some emerging characteristics of Western Zen that distinguish it from its Asian ancestry. Among the most obvious are those aspects of Sangha life that reflect the egalitarian principles so basic to North Americans and Europeans. For example, the annual Asta meetings are a Western innovation. Zen teachers from different lineages meeting together regularly to share information and experiences is unheard of in Japan. Within individual Sanghas, too, we have seen a general horizontalization of authority since the first generation of Zen teachers founded their centers. Most teachers, presumably, hold the line at spiritual matters, which require the authority of deep experience and, it is to be hoped, spiritual insight. But the boundary between spiritual and secular decisions is open to interpretation. At one major Zen center, abbots are now elected to 4-year terms by membership vote. Viewed from a historical perspective, Zen is undergoing an unprecedented metamorphosis. Unlike Buddhism as a whole, the Zen sect grew out of Confucian soil, and though it assumed distinctive forms in each of the other East Asian countries to which it migrated, a common denominator between the Zen communities and the wider society was the Confucian ethos that both took for granted. Thus Sangha relationships were shaped by the concept of li, or propriety, composed of rules governing the way of life. These rules, stressing filial piety, obedience to authority, and veneration of age and lineage, prized rank and protected the position and power of the ruling class. It would be hard to find a worldview more contrary to American dispositions. To be sure, many of the values of Confucianism, if assimilated, could serve to knit together our desperately confused, dislocated society. But Western civilization is cut out of different cloth. And as practice in this country has matured, Dharma centers from coast to coast have begun shedding some of the formalism, the unquestioning awe of authority, and other Confucian features of East Asian Zen that we gamely tried on in the early years, but which have since proved to be ill-fitting. Another significant change to Zen that is well underway in the West is our recognition of the equality of women as Zen practitioners. The largely invisible role of women in Asian Buddhism is no secret. Official teacher lineages, or patriarchal lines, are by definition composed exclusively of men. But women have been coming to awakening since before the Buddha himself, and scholars have learned that some of them ranked as genuine masters. Why, then, isn't a single one of them included in the formal lineage? This exclusiveness reflects their traditional position in Asian society as a whole, but it also can convey the false message that women generally don't rate with men in spiritual ability. The patriarchal line is, then, a reminder of how deep cultural biases can run, in this case undercutting the core Buddhist teaching that all beings without exception are equally endowed with the true nature of enlightenment. Buddhism's age-old acceptance of gender inequality is already under reform in the West. At last year's 13th annual Asta meeting, the majority of participants were women, many of them priests. As Western women become seasoned in Zen practice, they are quietly reforming attitudes and behavior, giving balance to the yang bias of traditional monastic Zen. Perhaps as a result, American Zen centers are consciously working to jettison the overly goal-driven, competitive, body-denying aspects of traditional Zen practice and are allowing the more process-oriented, cooperative, and nurturing sides of our true nature to express themselves. The truly realized person, male or female, will come to actualize all aspects of his or her nature. And all of us can, while falling short of that lofty state, at least begin reversing gender biases by changing the language and other forms of our heritage that contribute to them. To that end, the Rochester Zen Center, like some others, has changed patriarchal line to ancestral line, and added an homage. And to the unknown women, centuries of enlightened ones, whose commitment to the Dharma nourishes and sustains our practice. No doubt the most profound adaptation required of Zen in the West revolves around the Western notion of the self as an autonomous individual. This assumption is so basic to our way of thinking as to determine our entire worldview. But it is qualitatively different from the traditional Asian conception of self, in which a person is defined within a nexus of social relations, and dependent on a contextual web consisting of other persons as well as place, time, and history. This definition resonates strongly with Buddhist doctrine, in which the self is so thoroughly interdependent that it has no essential reality. Buddhism does not deny the self absolutely. It denies the self as an absolute, unchanging entity that exists independently. Once we've been conditioned to see ourselves as existing independently of social roles and relations, we become particularly susceptible to a host of self-referential illnesses, for which Western psychotherapy has developed as the medicine. I do not make a general practice of recommending psychotherapy to my students, for in the short term it can work at odds with Zazen. During the course of psychotherapy one will typically find oneself more preoccupied than usual with thoughts of self, and this self-concern is the antithesis of Zazen. On the other hand, for those who feel the need for it and are ready, psychotherapy makes just as much sense as surgery does for an athlete with a knee injury. With the help of some months of psychotherapy, many of my students have seen improvements not just in their relationships and work, but in the quality of their Zazen itself. Greater emotional stability and clarity, it seems, can alleviate some of the anxiety and self-concern that so commonly prevents one from reaching deeper states of meditative absorption. Nowhere is the notion of a separate self more securely fixed, and more vigorously asserted, than in the United States. From a Buddhist perspective, it is our national handicap. But it is the hand we Americans have been dealt, and moreover, the sense of alienation and self-consciousness that it spawns impels many of us to practice. Like it or not, each of us exists in mutual causality with our milieu. A fact which itself testifies to the permeable nature of the self. Not that trading in our individualistic sense of self for a more contextual one, even if we could, would be the solution. Every worldview offers a skewed representation of human existence, and by muting or repressing aspects of experience each generates suffering in different terms. Greed, ill will, and delusion are basic human afflictions, and the Asian cultures in which Zen was nourished also have their own ways of falsely dividing reality into categories that create suffering. In any case, we have to work with our mental formations, such as they are. Zazen works universally to dissolve these illusory structures, in whatever terms humans are acculturated to conceive of them. For Westerners, psychotherapy, as a homegrown system of healing, holds the promise of enhancing this awakening process. The realm of the psychological is not to be confused with that of essential nature, but neither are these two separate. Since Western Zen students, even those without psychological education, are by nature more psychologically oriented than their Asian counterparts, Zen teaching and practice will inevitably come to reflect that coloration. If it didn't, it would fail us. Western Zen teachers are increasingly falling in with their Vajrayana and Vipassana, the other two main streams of Buddhism in the West. Colleagues in accommodating themselves to Western psychological perspectives, if not methods. Those who have ignored the psychological needs of either their students or themselves have done so often at the cost of their own personal integrity and that of their students. And, consequently, the well-being and harmony of their sanghas. So far this has proved far more damaging to Buddhism than the very real danger of our psychologizing it. As a belief system, psychology rivals the Judeo-Christian tradition in its influence in the West. In fact, in our highly secular culture it probably has an edge over formal religion in that it is so easily assimilated by those of other faiths. Psychology and Buddhism have been courting each other ever since they met here. And now there are signs that Zen is beginning to adapt to the Judeo-Christian tradition as well, just as Buddhism did to Taoism and Confucianism in China. More and more books are coming out that advance Buddhist dialogues with Christianity and with Judaism. Most significantly of all, hybrids of actual Zen practice are appearing that incorporate Jewish and Christian elements. How does Buddhism, a non-theistic religion, find an accommodation with Judaism or Christianity? More easily, it would seem, than vice versa. The Buddha, while denying that he himself was any kind of God, refused either to deny or affirm the existence of God. The Zen school, known since its inception as a teaching beyond words and letters, without reliance on the sutras, points to the original mind that precedes all religion. As such, the teachings of the Zen masters have always resonated strongly with those of the Christian and Jewish mystics, as well as the teachings of the Sufis. When it comes to mixing the actual rituals and other devotional practices of Judaism and Christianity with those of Zen, however, I see problems. Granted, the American way, as Roshi Kapleau has said, is to borrow freely from all traditions, and we are accustomed to mixing and innovating in all matters of culture. But every spiritual tradition has its own character, refined over centuries in responsive communion with its practitioners. The Dalai Lama's public suggestion that Westerners might do better to remain within their own religious tradition rather than adopt Buddhism is one that I feel should not be taken too seriously. For many of us there is simply no choice, so deep is our affinity with the Buddha Dharma. Nonetheless, every great spiritual path has its own integrity, which is put at risk the more it is cobbled to elements of other traditions. I think of the comments made by an esteemed Buddhist scholar in explaining the disappearance of Buddhism in India. It didn't die, but was smothered in the loving embrace of Hinduism. Yet another major development of Zen in the West is the burgeoning interest in engaged Buddhism, a movement that endeavors to apply Buddhist compassion, i.e., wisdom in action, to social, political, and environmental problems. Traditionally, Buddhism has focused on individual spiritual practice as the most intelligent approach to relieving the suffering of all sentient beings. Engaged Buddhists agree that meditative practices are indispensable, but recognizing that we are also determined by the social and political systems in which we are enmeshed. Seek to remedy the ills of those systems by working actively for peace, justice, education, and ecological preservation. Such work advances